I'm Katie, mom to 2 littles and 4 angel babies. With a PhD and over a decade spent unraveling how our society shapes moms' experiences, I am here to shred the rulebooks and their relentless tide of expectations. In this safe space, the complexities of motherhood find a candid, unfiltered voice. We're Undefining Motherhood, one conversation at a time. I've spent 15 years researching motherhood and the past 4 working directly with moms enduring tough journeys through fertility, pregnancy loss, pregnancy, and postpartum. And of the thousands of things that I've learned, there's one that echoes time and again and has for centuries. As women, we're asked invasive questions about our bodies that people rarely, if ever, ask men. In this episode, we dive deep into our own stories, those of the Undefining Motherhood community at large, and pop in some fascinating tidbits of history as we try to answer this one question. Why does our society feel so comfortable asking personal questions about women's bodies? This conversation is riveting, so settle in. Living in a female body guarantees that you are going to spend your life being asked these invasive questions that men never get asked.
Yes, all the time.
Oh my God. Like, when are you going to get married?
When are you going to have a baby?
When are you going to have a baby? Oh, I bet you've gotten a lot of that one.
Yes, definitely.
In your life. So you got married at
21.
21.
And I am 40 years old now.
Yes.
And I was married for 13 years and we never had a kid. So
you didn't get when are we going to get married, but like,
yes.
How many times do you think you were asked when you were going to have a baby?
Probably at least 3 or 4 times every holiday. So spread that out over 13 years.
My God.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I'm going to try to do that math. That's not my thing.
No, me either.
So yeah. And then when you got divorced, were people asking you things like, but what about a baby? Was that part of it? Or did they at least know to back off then?
Yeah, I think they backed off because they thought, that having a baby outside of marriage is the worst thing you could possibly ever do, right? So because I wasn't married, the question just sort of automatically discontinued.
Automatically disappeared. Yeah, that Southern life. Because I think So John actually bought my ring a year before he gave it to me.
Yes, and then he hid it from you.
And he didn't hide it from me. I had access to it. I would show it to people. This is the ring he won't let me have. Yeah. Look how pretty it is on my finger. But even then, people were asking. People knew he had a ring. And even still, I was getting bombarded with, when are you going to get married? And I was 25.
Do you think they were asking John the same questions?
When
are you going to give it to her? When are you going to give it to her?
I think the only people who asked John that questions were my friends who knew how frustrated I was. And they were just trying to give him the note of John, give her the ring.
Sure.
Give her the ring. And he was just waiting he wanted to have a sweet proposal on this big trip that we took.
He's the best.
I know, he's so sweet. And I just wanted the ring. I didn't care about the trip. I mean, in hindsight, it was really special and really sweet.
How long were you guys married? So he finally gave you the ring. Right?
Uh-huh.
How long were you married before you started to try to conceive?
Oh gosh. So we were married for about 4 or 5 years before we started trying to conceive. We took some time. Yeah. I was in a PhD program. He was working for his dad's business, and he was really growing in his role there, and it was becoming very important. So we both had big things on our plates. I had developed a love for travel. I never traveled as a kid. And then in grad school, I got to study abroad, and it became a big thing. So we wanted to build that in. So we really didn't start trying until that point. It was stunning. It was stunning that it wasn't easy. You know what I actually did that's so funny is I tried to time it around grad school and say, John, we have to get pregnant this month.
Right. So that you can have a baby in the summer.
So that I can have a baby in June and have built-in maternity leave because I don't get maternity. Yeah. So
did people ask you, when are you going to have one in those first 4 years before you started trying?
Oh my God.
All the time?
All the time. Every wedding we attended, every party we went to, every family event, all the time. And because I wasn't interested in trying yet at that point, people also really judged that. Like, oh, but you would be such a good mom.
Yes.
And I was like, that doesn't mean I do want a kid. I just don't want one yet. And then when we started trying, and it was a really long journey. We talked about that a couple episodes ago. It felt like the most invasive question that anyone could possibly ask me. John had to really start playing defense on it if it was at a function where he was there. Because to be asked when you're going to have a baby.
Right, when you're trying
and you're not getting pregnant, or we actually had to travel to Ohio for John's funeral when I was in the week between the wait of knowing I was probably having a miscarriage and finding out for sure.
And wait, so whose funeral?
It was Sean's uncle's funeral. And when he passed away, I was about 6 weeks pregnant, but I was so bloated that I actually had to go to a maternity store to find clothes that fit, knowing I might be miscarrying. I already knew this from a really bad ultrasound. And I had to find these clothes anyway because I needed them to hide the fact that I looked pregnant from that pregnancy bloat. I looked like I was 18 weeks along and I was, 6 weeks along. And I didn't want people asking because I knew I might be losing this baby. And I remember 3 different occasions on that trip where different people at different times, none of them knew the situation and none of them knew the others had either asked when we were going to have a baby, commented how good I was with those kids.
Yeah.
And one mentioned the biological clock and it might be about time for you to start trying. And I was like literally checking for blood every time I wiped because I knew that my pregnancy was likely not viable, but I was pregnant at this time.
Let me ask you this. Why do you feel like people feel comfortable asking us these questions about our bodies?
Oh my gosh. Why is that? So, I'm a historian in a lot of ways. I'm a researcher. And I think it comes from this history of women's bodies being seen as property. Right? I don't think that's all of it, but I think that's probably the first part. So let's talk about that. You have a big historical background as well. Yes. So for a long time, and to an extent now still, right? When we look at legislation that's happening around women's bodies, we're making these assumptions at a very cultural level that women's bodies are not the women's bodies alone, that they are in part
decisions are being made about women's bodies by women.
Not by women, by other people. When this is not something that's happening with men's bodies. And there's so much historical precedent here. And the time period that I am most expert in is the 19th century, which means 1800s because our centuries, they don't match up. And at that point in time, women were considered to be chattel.
Can you explain that word?
Oh, yeah. So chattel is the idea that a woman is property. The way that a cow can be bought and purchased, a woman could be bought and purchased in a similar kind of way. And so this manifested in a couple of different ways. One of those ways was that when a woman got married, if she was a woman of any kind of means, if she had
property transfers, right?
Yes. Yeah, if she had any kind of wealth, the property transfers. It goes from her father to her husband. It is never actually hers.
Right.
There were also, systems in which people were paying dowries for marriages. And so they're saying, okay, this is what I will give to you, the man, for marrying my daughter.
So it's a commercial transaction.
A commercial transaction. And even that happens where women aren't coming with a lot of property. In fact, I think it happens more where they're not coming with a lot of assets behind them. Women weren't even allowed to control their own property and, even finances for so long. We're still getting around to the point where maybe they can control their bodies. So I think that's a big part of it. What do you think?
We can have bank accounts now.
We can have bank accounts now. Credit cards.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
So if women are seen as this kind of property, how do you think that connects to motherhood? What's the link there?
Oh, it's so hard. I think, in terms of in terms of motherhood, it's really tricky. I think we need to talk about that a lot this season. But I think in terms of these questions, in terms of like, okay, when are you going to get married? When are you going to have a baby? When are you going to have another baby? That's a big place where it plays into motherhood. I think a big part of the struggle that we're really dealing with is that the expectation is that because you were born with a uterus, you are meant to be a mother.
And that uterus is common property.
And this is your job. This is your calling. And that could be like religious or that could be social, but like this is what you're supposed to do. And I think that's really what we're getting at here.
Do you think that's why people always touch pregnant women's bellies? Just like, like
I definitely think there's a connection.
I mean,
right?
I even feel the urge too, Yeah,
I do too. Yeah. I feel the urge. I pull it in, but like I feel it.
Yeah.
Even one of my best friends, I'm like, can I touch your belly?
You got to get consent, but like you still want to do it.
Consent.
For sure.
But yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Women are expected to become mothers. And there are so many reasons for that that we can talk about. We can go into detail if we want to.
Sure. But as property, right, like that chattel attitude, right, is that if you own something and it produces something else, it becomes more relevant, right? It's commercially acceptable. It makes you money, right? So in days of yore, right, when kings had a baby, when the wife has a baby, right, like that's the moment at which everybody's excited because there's a new heir.
There's a new heir, especially they're excited about the male baby. They're not excited about the female baby because while we do have histories of very important queens who have had extremely long reigns, typically the way the systems have been set up have made it where like a lot of things had to go wrong with all of those male heirs in order for those women to get on the throne.
So it goes back to family and lineage and the idea that you will procreate and reestablish the earth.
All of it.
That's your job, Katie.
That's your job to procreate. And I think when we're getting these invasive questions, we do need to consider who we're getting them from because I think there's a really big narrative going on right now where we talk about like stop asking women when they're going to get pregnant. Stop asking women when they're going to have a baby. And a lot of this comes from the fertility community, the pregnancy loss community. I know I have posted this on Instagram many times, but I think we also do need to have in mind where the people asking these questions are coming from. It doesn't make the questions okay. Like we need to find ways to make that better in our cultural narrative, but they're not asking these questions to hurt us.
Sure.
They're not asking these questions out of malice. It's that particularly imagining our moms, our grandmothers, the boomer generation.
They love to ask questions.
But also
Did you lose weight? Did you get a haircut?
Did you lose weight?
Yes.
Or
did you gain weight?
My favorite is the pick at the belly. It's like, oh, you're getting a little fluffy around there.
Don't do that.
Yeah. But also, think about how they were raised. They were raised by,
Well, women's rights have just come a long way,
they've come a long
in
way.
40 years.
But like John's grandmother had to go off to work while her husband was fighting in World War II. And then when he came home, like quite literally, they had a population that they needed to rebuild because we lost a lot of human life. And so...
Don't you just want to say that to them sometimes, though? Like, we're not over here trying to repopulate after World War II.
We're not over here trying to repopulate after World War II. And, like, we sure hope that we live in a world where we're not going to be trying to repopulate. We're not having population problems right now. We are seeing birth rates slow. Sure. And I wonder if that contributes. But I think it's just that people... Even if the people who were repopulating after World War II are no longer living, their children are, and they're our mothers and our grandmothers. And they were raised under this assumption that your job is to become a mother.
So you're saying we should be nice to them?
I'm saying we should give them grace.
Okay, fine.
I'm saying that we should have these conversations, and we should send podcast episodes like this to our grandmothers and our moms and say, hey, I think this is a really important conversation. But what we should also be doing is recognizing that when they ask, maybe our job isn't to school them at the dinner table, because they're coming from such a different lived experience than we are. That maybe our job is to help explain why we'd prefer that they not ask that, but also give them a lot of empathy for the fact that their lived experience and worldview make it more reasonable to ask these questions.
That's a really lovely way to put it.
This episode is sponsored exclusively by Genate by Snip Therapeutics, providing genetics-powered nutrition tailored for every stage of the fertility, pregnancy, and postpartum journeys. Now, friend, I tend to get excited about things, but I am not even kidding you when I say that I cried real, literal tears when I saw the ingredient list in Genate's new prenatal vitamin. Their essential prenatal multivitamin is the culmination of groundbreaking research and a deep understanding of what moms and growing babies truly need. And here's what that means. Genetic research shows that many women don't get the nutrition they need, even if they eat a balanced diet and take a prenatal supplement. And this is because of genetic misspellings that impair their body's ability to metabolize certain nutrients. Genate has taken this into account in their formulations by designing a supplement with the most bioavailable nutrients in the correct amounts for your baby's development and health. And when paired with the Genate test, you can learn about your personalized genetics to know if there are extra supplements or foods you should be adding to your daily regimen. I am obsessed with the deal they're offering if you get the bundle, including the Genate test and their essential prenatal vitamin subscription. Check them out at undefiningmotherhood.com/Genate and use code undefiningmotherhood10 for 10% off. We can spend hours dissecting each of these questions, right? When are you going to have a baby? When are you going to get married? So on, so on. We could go on forever. But for the sake of this episode, I think we should focus in. So let's talk about this question. When are you going to have a baby? Let's dig in here.
All right, I'm ready. I think in order to do that, we have to kind of take it from two different angles, right?
Okay.
First is that being a woman means that you are a mother, right?
Yes.
Like this connection between the two, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then the second is that if you're not a mother, or if you choose not to be a mother, or if you're struggling to be a mother, that you are in some way defective, right? So where do you want to start with those two things?
Okay. Well, I think we have to start with how this question implies that your goal is to be a mother, right?
Sure.
And where that comes from. I think if we can understand that, we can really feel why we might feel defective for these reasons. So let's start there. It makes me think of this insane thing that happened in the Victorian period. So bear with my quick piece of history because this
I'm ready. I love history.
Fascinating. Okay. So you know how, if you remember from history class, England was like a major, major colonizer during the 1800s. Still is. But like, yeah, okay. Like big time. Like there were a few countries who were kind of predominant in that, and they were Queen Victoria of all the wonderful things I can say about her, I can equally say some pretty terrible, and this is one. This was a big time for suffragette movements in England, and so there was a lot going on. And so basically, England was creating these penal colonies, right? Where they're shipping people off to other countries, pretending that they're like creating countries in them. But really what they're doing is they're just sending prisoners to like Australia and Canada and saying that like, we don't want to pay for you anymore. So we're going to put you on a boat and then you're going to go populate these places that already have people living there. But we're going to pretend that we're starting that population.
Colonizing. Got it.
Yeah. So that's what they're doing. If that's not crazy enough, because we all know that part of history. Here's the part people don't know that's really insane. So in the 1850s, it was actually proposed that they start shipping unmarried women of a certain age.
What, like 27?
So people they called spinsters or they called old maids. So what this was, they called it the surplus woman problem.
Oh, wow,
so
that's
a
rich.
census, right? A census in the early 1850s showed that there were more women than there were men. And that there were more radicals than there had been in the previous consensus, like radicals versus conservative thinkers.
Like more radical women?
Right, like just more radical thinkers. And so the idea was these old maids, these spinsters who didn't marry, they must be radical women, right? And also, they're not procreating. They're not doing what women are supposed to do. And so the proposal was to ship them off to these colonies with these prisoners and just so we wouldn't have surplus women.
That'll solve it.
Yeah. That'll solve it, right? And they called them the old maids and they were trying to get rid of them. So like, I don't think it ever actually happened. One of the major like feminist leaders of the time was a woman called Frances Power Cobb, and she has this really great article in one of their most popular magazines called "What Shall We Do with Our Old Maids?" And it's like this satirical. It's really lovely. But this is the epitome of what we're talking about, right? Of saying if a woman does not become a mother by the expected time in her life, and maybe that expected time changes, she becomes irrelevant.
We ship her off.
But I think this speaks to what we're dealing with even now, right? So women are being asked, when are you going to have a baby? Because the expectation is your role.
Your value.
Your value is equated to becoming a mother.
That's why little girls play with baby dolls, right?
It's literally, my mom bought my daughter a baby doll for her very first Christmas when she was just turning 1 year old.
Nothing wrong with that, Kathy.
I bought my son a baby doll when he was either 3 or 4.
Even better.
And my mom fussed at me for it. Like, this is the narrative we're implanting from early ages. And
Cabbage Patches were my favorite.
They were my favorite. I loved Cabbage Patch Kids. I went and adopted one. Did you go to Babyland General? Yeah. Yes, because that's near where we live.
Yeah, exactly.
So we got to go, like, actually adopt the dolls. And
have you been as an adult? Side note. It is really creepy.
Is it?
Yes.
Oh my God. No.
Yeah, like Mother Cabbage gives birth.
Oh,
like it's terrifying.
Oh, wow.
Never
we need to explore this sometime.
Okay.
Like we need to go here and video and explore this because this is going to be a thing. And I wanted the dolls. So this isn't to say like, oh, people were forcing this on me, but there are girls who don't want the dolls. And yet we still try to force it. There are women who don't want to become mothers. And there are women who don't know if they want to become mothers. And I can think of quite a few of them specifically. My friend Shannon has talked at length about the frustration she feels with the expectation that she should want children, and she does not want children. And she has talked about, and actually quite a few of my friends who I can think of who don't want children have talked about what people say to them is, oh, just wait, you will.
Oh, yeah. You'll experience the best love of your life if you have a kid.
Yeah, you'll want it one day. And
that clock will start ticking.
Yes.
I've heard all of these.
I mean, what I would hear, I have always known I wanted children, so this has not been my experience. But what I would hear in these situations is you just don't know yourself yet. You're not mature enough. Definitely. You don't understand. Yep. Like, you cannot possibly want the thing that you know that you want. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it feels like it sort of devalues the current moment, you know? Like, grad school, people would ask me all the time because I was in my late 20s, like, well, when are you going to have a baby? But I was like, but I'm doing this other thing, right? Like, I'm getting a PhD. It's very exciting for me. I moved to Canada. I did all of these things that I thought were really brave. And here you are like, but when are you going to have a kid? Like,
right. They're not lauding your bravery at doing really hard things. And also, you know, you went through a long time of a lot of ambivalence about this. You've written about it for our website. So how does this question make you feel as someone who isn't sure if you want kids?
I feel like it just means that everybody is waiting on my life to start. Yeah. When I feel like I'm already living it. Like,
you're already.
I got a PhD. I got a job. I've done all these things, but
you've got an amazing life.
Yeah, there's still this expectation that something is coming for me, right? Like that I haven't yet begun with all the cool things that I wanted to do, right?
Yes. Oh my God, that's such a great way to put it, and that's heartbreaking because
I'm not waiting. Right?
You're
like
not waiting.
I'm doing the thing,
and there are so many things that we all want to do, and like there are things coming for all of us.
Yeah, and but
people aren't looking at me the same way,
right? Yeah,
because I have 2 children.
Sure.
It makes me think of that scene in Eat, Pray, Love, where Elizabeth Gilbert is talking about being on the bathroom floor, not sure if she wants to stay, knowing she doesn't want to stay in her marriage, but not knowing how to end it. And her big breakdown that she's having is over the fact that she is actively trying to conceive with her husband, and she actively does not want children, and she knows that she never wants them, and she's battling this like emotional chasm of what I want and what
everyone
other
else
people want. And what's so interesting about this is that when I first read that book, which I've read a million times.
Yes, I know.
I thought to myself, and I was much younger then, and I was not ready for children yet at the time. But when I first read that book, by the time I finished the book, I actually thought to myself, it's a shame that she doesn't want children because she's brilliant. Yeah. And we need more of that in our world. And now, 15 years later, I look back on my own thoughts on that and think, wow, how influenced are we by these social narratives that I could hear what turned into a really eloquent or lifelong articulation of why she has an incredibly fulfilling path that has nothing to do with being a mother. And even still, I was a little bummed by it. And I'm not anymore, but I think it speaks.
It goes back to our disclaimer, right? Like, maybe people think, oh, you're brilliant, you have all of your life together, you're living the dream. It would be so great if you could bring a kid into the world. And maybe that's the impetus behind asking that question instead of like, when are you going to have a kid?
Exactly. I think you're right. And I do think, as much as I hate the comment, I hate it with a burning passion, not as much as I think you probably do.
I really hate it.
I hate the question or the comment, you won't understand until you have kids.
Yeah, that drives me nuts.
It's maddening. But I do think there is a way that we put our personal biases on things because we realize, like, I went through a long period of time trying to imagine my life without children because we really weren't sure we were going to be able to have them. And realizing all of the ways in which it could be amazing and the different things that we could do. But I am so thankful to finally have what I have that I'm still tempted when I hear someone, especially someone who's young, say they don't want children, to say, oh, but that's going to change. And I try not to. I just try to say, hey, like, you get to decide, and you don't have to decide right now. You can decide now and you can change your mind later, or you can not change your mind later. But it's just so much a part of our narrative. So let's get back to this idea of defectiveness, because I think that's what we're hitting on here.
There too.
Did you, in your sort of ambivalence toward it, I want it, but I don't know if I want it, but I love it, but also I'd be happy without it. Did you feel like you were socially, morally defective, or did people make you feel that way, or was that not a thing for you?
I'd never felt defective, right? Like, I think if it's not something that you understand about yourself, you can't feel like pejoratively about it, right? Like, I just didn't feel bad about it. But it made me question why everybody else thought that I should feel bad, right? Like, I don't feel one way or the other about this, but everyone else has an opinion, right? It's kind of like everyone has a question. Everyone has an opinion about when you should have kids.
It's the same thing. Yeah. Like, they get to place judgment on your life because you still are somehow property in some way.
I didn't ask for that. I'm doing just fine over here. Right.
You know what this makes me think of, and it's a good transition to that. We also wanted to talk about what happens for people who are struggling to conceive or struggling to carry. My friend Kendra is this delightful human. She is the loudest person you will ever meet in the most wonderful way. Right? One of those people who you just sit down in a room with and she takes over the room without meaning to, without trying to, and leaves everyone roaring in laughter and then creates conversations between you people. Like, she's heaven, okay? So she went through fertility struggles. She's a surgeon and she was in medical school at the time, and she and her husband were trying to conceive. They now have twins. But she is one of these just bold people. And she got to a point where she was so frustrated with the questions she was getting about having kids when she was actively going through fertility struggles, but was also in this medical universe where she really had a better grasp than most of us do, I think, on like what's really going on in her body and how much it's not her fault, that her response to this question every single time started to become, stop asking about my uterus. It's not yours.
I want to borrow that.
Oh my God, right? She has told me anyone who wants to borrow it can borrow it. I put it on Instagram years ago. We should put it on a t-shirt. If you want this in a t-shirt, tell us in the comments, because I kind of want it on a t-shirt. Or a coffee mug.
Yeah.
T-shirt's better. You know, and what that really signals is the invasiveness.
Like it's a literal organ in your body.
It is a literal organ in your body that people are inquiring about. And no one thinks of it that way, right? And so when you're struggling to conceive or you're struggling to carry.
Do you feel like that organ is defective in some way?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question, because for me, that organ was defective.
Right, yeah.
Like literally defective. So let me step back just a tiny bit. We talked about this a lot in one of our intro episodes. So go back and check that out if you want to hear the full story here. But basically, we tried to conceive for 1.5 years before we conceived successfully. And I felt so much shame over my inability to get pregnant that no one other than John and me knew we were trying to conceive. No one. I'm close with my family. I always have been. They didn't know. My very best friends did not know. No one knew. And like, you knew me during that time. I am not one who keeps secrets about my own life. I'm a freaking open book, right? Like, I will keep things private for John's sake sometimes, because he is not the same way. Yeah. He believes in privacy, and I try to honor that where I can.
It's good of you.
But for me, this was me. This was me feeling so defective and broken for not being able to conceive.
That says a lot. For sure.
It says a lot. And then when I started going through a recurrent miscarriage, basically what happened was I felt so broken, and so I was getting incredibly depressed. I have a history of anxiety, but I don't really have a history of depression. And I was getting just very, very into an extremely bad emotional state. And what I realized was I'm not being authentic to myself in keeping this quiet. And so I started talking very openly about my losses and what we were going through and the family we were trying to grow, to the point that I recall going to a wedding with John for one of his work colleagues. So this might not have even been appropriate. I don't know. But one of the women at that wedding, who I knew pretty well at least, asked me, oh, you know, are you guys trying when you're going to try to have a baby? And I was like, actually, I just had a miscarriage 2 weeks ago. And I started just being really, really, really.
I bet she regretted that.
I bet she did. And part of me is glad, and another part of me is like, no, I never want to make someone feel guilty, because again, they were raised in this culture where it's okay to ask, and so it's so tricky.
Brene Brown says, "Clear is kind."
Clear is kind. Clear, and that's what it is. I didn't blame her for it. I I wasn't angry with her for asking. I just wanted to be honest. That saved my mental health during recurrent miscarriage. But what it also allowed me to start trying to do was recognize that this was not a personal defect. Now, funnily enough, what we did actually discover, we now know multiple things that we believe caused my recurrent miscarriages. One of them is connected to an immunodeficiency that I have that we didn't get diagnosed until after Jack was born. Yeah. But I just kind of happened to be on the medication that would treat it. And also at the time, we didn't know that medication would treat it. So even if I'd had the diagnosis, it wouldn't have gotten, like, it's crazy how it worked out, really. So we think that might have been part of it. We also discovered that I had something called chronic endometritis, which is an infection in your uterus. And I had to do like mega antibiotics to get rid of that for like, I think it was like 6 weeks worth of antibiotics. And then I still had another loss after we treated that. And what we ultimately discovered was that 70% of my uterine lining was avascular, which means it wasn't receiving blood flow. So these embryos were implanting and they weren't able to grow. So the truth of the matter is that actually my uterus had a defect, and that was causing my losses.
So, like, can you get real English major on me?
Okay.
What's the difference between your uterus having a defect and you being defective?
Yes, and that is the thing. I asked my doctor, because we love to blame women in these situations. Well, if you would just relax and it'll happen.
I love that one.
Right? Like,
have you met me? I don't relax yet,
well, and also like we have all of the data on it. And I'm sorry, but your stress did not cause your pregnancy loss. Yeah. So
it's what you can control.
It's what you can control. Yeah. And so that's the thing. We like to blame women. And I asked my doctor, how did this happen? Mm-hmm. And he looked at me almost like I was crazy for even asking, like in an empathetic way. This doctor was not one who ever made me feel less than or bad. He was lovely, and I credit him for my 2 children's lives, him and his wife, actually, because she was my gynecologist and he was my fertility specialist. And he was like, you were born this way. You were born this way. My uterus has always been this way. And something about that really helped me to separate these two things. Yes, my body was causing these losses, but no, I did nothing wrong. And that is the case for women who are going through infertility and who are going through miscarriages, recurrent pregnancy loss, whatever the case may be. They did nothing wrong. I remember when I had my first miscarriage, my doctor made me put my phone down because I was typing every single word she said because I wanted to like go back to it later. She made me put my phone down and she made me look her in the eye. And she said, this is not your fault. Nothing you did could have caused this. Shy of jumping out of an airplane, and I'm going to be honest, that really probably wouldn't have done it either.
Don't do that, though. Don't
do it. But like, that's how much it was important to her for me to understand. And
that's a good doctor.
She's an amazing doctor. You're going to hear, or we're going to talk more about her throughout this season. She's incredible. And that is kind of a permission slip I needed that allowed me at this time to understand my uterus has a defect is not the same as me being a defective person. And if we want to equate it to something simpler, someone who has arthritis, they have limitations that cause them pain in their body, but it doesn't change who they are as a person. Someone who gets
doesn't mean they're bad,
right?
Anyway, because they can't unscrew a jar. Or,
exactly. But here's the thing: historically, women going through fertility struggles were quote unquote bad. They were blamed for these things, and so that leads us to think, hey, maybe we are defective. I think in this way more than others. It makes me think of a story My last history lesson of the day.
I'm ready. Give it to me.
There was this doctor, and if you're squeamish, like you might want to just push forward by 60 seconds here. There was this doctor. He was the preeminent doctor in London, in England. He was the president of like all of obstetrics in England. I believe this was like 1860s, 1870s, so 19th century, 1800s. And he applied leeches to a woman's cervix while she was pregnant. And the next day, she had a miscarriage. And he wrote—
It was his fault.
Publicly in the newspaper the case of her story and said, and the next day she miscarried because she went out dancing when I had told her to keep quiet. Wow. So we have this history of saying to women, it's your fault. You are the problem. You are defective, specifically when it comes to their reproductive bodies. And I think that's one of the reasons that this "when are you going to have a baby" question hits so hard for moms struggling to conceive or for moms struggling to carry, because our culture has told them this is what your body should be able to do and this is what you should want, and now you are failing. And you are less than.
Right. And one of your main mission statements for Undefining Motherhood, right, is to give people this permission slip, right?
To give them—
it is not your fault.
To undefine motherhood. So in a nutshell, Undefining Motherhood came initially, and now it's multi-pronged, from the idea that I had carried 4 pregnancies and I was still having to do what other people wanted to do on Mother's Day without being considered. And my heart was breaking. I was still having to work around what the other kids in the family needed for holidays because I didn't have kids, so my life was easier. And it broke me that no one said, hey, you're a mother. You're a mother too. I had one friend who validated that for me, and that was game-changing, really amazing. So what she actually did is she was my office mate at the time, and we were both trying to conceive. And so she had kind of been through this pregnancy loss journey with me, and she got pregnant. And she was in her first trimester, and she was experiencing some scary symptoms. And she said, Katie, I hope it's appropriate to ask you this, but you know the first trimester better than anyone I know because you've been through it 4 times. Is what I'm experiencing normal? And while most people think, oh my God, how could she have asked that? For me, this was the first time that anyone said, you're a mother.
You've done it. Yeah.
You've done it. You get it. And I was able to be involved in her pregnancy in a way I never was with anyone else's because I felt so seen and validated. And so this is something you can take with you. What can we do? How can we do better? You can validate the experiences of what people are going through. You can acknowledge their struggles. You can meet them where they are, and you can recognize that you are a mother. You have embryo babies, or you're trying to conceive, or you've carried pregnancies, or whatever their situation is.
Or you're an aunt, or you love your pets.
You're doing
friends.
all these things.
Yeah.
You're a foster mom. There are so many ways. You can just validate that.
Motherhood is a role.
Motherhood is a role, and motherhood is it's a verb. You don't have to have a baby in your arms that you conceived and birthed to be one. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Undefining Motherhood podcast. It's been an honor to share this time with you. Remember, you're not just a listener, you're an essential part of our community. If today's conversation resonated with you, I have 3 simple requests for how you can help us grow. First, subscribe wherever you listened so you don't miss an episode. Second, we'd love it if you could leave us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast, as that's one of the most important ways we can grow and share our message and community. And finally, we'd love to hear from you. Jump over to Instagram and find us at Undefining Motherhood, where you'll see a post about this week's episode where we can continue the conversation. Thank you for being a part of the Undefining Motherhood community, where together, we're making change. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.